Okay, so this lecture is going to be more around network discussion and security, but very important because I want you to really understand what goes and when a request comes from the clients and goes all the way to your application. So I said it's good. Let's get started. So sometime we may want to block an IP address from a client because it's going to be a bad actor. Maybe it's trying to access our application. And so we want to know the line of the defense. So let's start from the very simple solution architecture in which we have an EC2 instance in a security group in a VPC, and that instance has a public IP. So it is publicly accessible. And this is how our clients get into our EC2 instance. So say you wanted to block that client, the first line of defense would be the network ACL NACL in our VPC, which is at a VPC level, at the subnet level, VPC subnet level. As the security group has subnet is not here, so that we will say that it's at the subnet level. We can create a deny rule for the client IP address. Very simple, very quick, very cheap, and the client will just be rejected. Okay. Then for the security group of the EC2 instance, we cannot have deny rules. We can only have allow rules. So if we know that only a subset of authorized clients can only access our EC2 instance, then it is good in our security group to just define a subset of IP to allow into our EC2 instance. But if your application is global, we obviously don't know all the IP addresses that will access our application, and so the security group here will not be very helpful. Finally, you could run an optional firewall software on your EC2 to block from within your software that request from the client. Now obviously if the shutters like the request has already reached your EC2 instance, then it will have to be processed and it will be a CPU cost to processing that request. So it's a very simple use case, but we see already the difference between the NACL, a security group, and a host firewall. Now let's push this one step further. We introduce an application load balancer. So again this ALB is defined within your VPC, and we still have our EC2 instance, but now we have two security groups. We have the ALB security group and we have the EC2 security group. So in this case, our load balancer in this architecture is going to be in between our clients and our EC2, and it will do something called correction termination. So the clients actually connects to the ALB, which will terminate the connection and initiate a new connection from the ALB into our EC2 instance. In this case, our EC2 security group must be configured to allow the security group of the application load balancer ALB, because the EC2 instance can be deployed in a private subnet with a private IP, and the source of the traffic it sees comes from the ALB, not the client. So from a security group perspective here, we only allow the application load balancer security group. Okay, application load balancer, so we are on the safe side here this time. Now for the application load balancer of the security group, the security group of the ALBA, we need to allow the clients, and again if we have a range of IP, we know that we can configure the security group. If it's a global application, we have to allow everything, and then their line of defense is going to be at the network NACL level, network ACL level. So okay, this makes sense, and this should be something you already know. Now let's look at the NLB in example, and this is something I have not covered yet in this course because it is events concept, but for the network load balancer it does not do connection termination. So the traffic and this is an over some simplification actually goes through our network load balancer. And so as such, there's no such thing as a security group for a network load balancer. The traffic is passed through, so that means that the client originating IP is going to go all the way to our EC2 instances. Even if our EC2 instance sits within a private subnet and has a private IP, so this can be complicated here. But the idea here is that if we again know the source IP of all the clients, we can define it in the EC2 security group. But if we are trying to deny one IP address for our clients, the only line of defense here we have is our NACL and network ACL. So super important. This can be a difficult concept to get it, but the network load balancer does not have a security group. You should make clear on it, okay? And all the traffic goes through it. So our EC2 instances sees the client public IP address. Okay, so I'm sorry for. Okay, so now let's get back to our simpler case, which was to have the application load balancer. Something we can do deny an IP to install web application firewall WAF, or now this WAF is going to be a little more expensive because this is an additional service and a firewall service, that is, but in here we are able to do some complex filtering on IP addresses, and we can establish rules that will count the request to prevent a lot of requests going on at the same time from the clients, and so we have more power over our security or our application load balancer. So web application firewall is not a service in between your client and your application load balancer. It is a service we have installed on the application load balancer, and we can define a bunch of rules. So this is one of the more line of defense here. Similarly, if we use CloudFront of the ALB application load balancer, CloudFront sits outside of our VPC. Okay, so as such, our application load balancer needs to allow all the CloudFront's public IPs coming from the edge location, and there's a list of it outlined online, but that's it. So coming from the ALB, it does not see the client IP. What it sees is the CloudFront public IP. So as such, the network ACL NACL here, which sits at the boundary of our VPC, is not helpful at all because it cannot help us block the client IP address. And so in this case, we are trying to block a client from CloudFront. We have two possibilities. Say we are attacked by a country, then we can use the platform's geo restriction feature to restrict all the country from our clients to be denied on the CloudFront. Or if there's one specific IP that envies us, we can again use web application firewall WAF to induce some IP address filtering, just like we did before. Well, so as we can see, based on the architecture, we have different lines of defenses to block an IP address, and they are normal. Once we put everything together, it all makes sense, but I think it's good to show you exactly through a diagram what happens from a network perspective, how to properly configure a security group, and where to set up your IP address filtering. And with this, I hope you understand this lecture. I hope it makes sense, and I will see you in the next lecture.